Episode 35. Today's episode is going to be on the non-aggression principle, or called NAP for short. And today I'm joined with my co-host Anna Voltes, and I'll let you introduce yourself before we get started here.
Yes, hello, I'm Anwiltus. Uh, every other episode, the show goes on my channel, so that's why I'm here today with you.
Yes. And I believe we have next week's episode already lined up for to discuss. So, yes, I highly recommend subscribing to Anna Voltis' channel as well, of course. So, I guess my first question, kind of to you, because I know you've been involved in philosophy for a while, and I believe you've probably been thinking about politics also for a while, uh, in several types of ways of thinking about it. Have you ever kind of thought about the non-aggression principle before, or have you kind of like skipped over it, or like, yeah, have you put thought into this before?
Yes, I would say I certainly have. I've heard about it before, and I thought about it before. Now, of course, in preparation for this, I have done quite a bit of research. Although I would say that because this episode was delayed a bit, I actually had more time to do research. So, in that sense, I've tried to listen to multiple different perspectives on the non aggression principle to see which ones the more popular ones were, and perhaps some criticisms that people have of it. And I think that obviously anybody who is familiar with how the non aggression principle works out, especially in political circles and circles questioning the philosophy of it, particularly the ethical ramifications. There's a number of different perspectives on how exactly it applies and how strictly it should be held to by those who hold to it, and also whether it corresponds to similar concepts in other philosophical backgrounds.
Right, for sure. And um, we should probably define what the non aggression principle is for anyone that may be unaware. This is a very simplistic definition of it, and I could pull up a dictionary definition if we want. But in short, the way I kind of interpret it, the non aggression principle is that it's the idea that force should not be done to anybody, and it later defines force usually uh, well, I should say it's. I'm not sure if it was originally a libertarian idea, but a lot of what you read about the principle the Libertarian Party has adopted. So a lot of their ideas go into the non-aggression principle. So, like for instance, they would say force is taxation, or force is a forced military draft. It shouldn't. The government shouldn't force you to be in the military. They use examples like that, saying that this is a violation of this principle that essentially says, you should be left alone. Um, but
Yes, so
yeah,
I would understand that common definitions concerning the use of force include the initiation of violence in a situation that had not escalated to violence previously, or also violence towards a person or towards the property of a person, the person himself usually also being considered his own property under the idea of self ownership, which is a common underpinning of many formulations of the non aggression principle.
right. And like I've already mentioned a little bit, the idea is very simplistic, and most of where I learned about the non-aggression principle is through the Libertarian Party. I don't know too much outside of it, outside of the theories within it, but essentially it gives the first grounds to start with. So, for instance, like when you join the Libertarian Party, you have to sign a pledge, you could call it, I guess, or an oath, I think is what they officially say it is, saying that you agree with the non aggression principle in order to be a part of the party. Uh, so it's kind of a like a first stepping stone to the philosophy of a libertarian. Now that's not necessarily what the discussion is about today, but that's where I've gotten most of my insight of what the non-aggression principle is. But the
Yeah,
reason, oh no, go on.
yeah, and I was going to say that the non-aggression principle, while it refers to the initiation of force or the threat of the initiation of force, it in itself does not refer to the response uh, against force. So, most people that hold to the non aggression principle are not total pacifists or non-violence persons and would be in favor of defending themselves and their property.
Right, that's a very good point. Uh, that's why in most of the arguments I've heard against the non-aggression principle are saying that it's too simple. It's too simplistic. It makes sense. I haven't heard really anybody say that the non-aggression principle doesn't make sense, but they say that it's too simple. Like everybody kind of knows this. You need to have something that teaches somebody something they don't know, and that's a common argument I hear against it. And I think that's part of what you just mentioned in the effort of the principle doesn't teach you everything you need to know right away. It's just one part of many parts what you would have to know in order to be a better person or know what the ideal government should be if that makes sense in that way. Uh, Basically, it's not the only answer you have to have.
Yeah, and of course, the non-aggression principle, I would say, has, as you said, a lot of people consider it to be simple, but I would say that in practice, most people have additional qualifications that they make to it, either derived from other values, some of these values which they may actually be considered to be greater than a non-aggression principle, or values lesser to the non-aggression principle, or that may be accessory to it. For example, uh, a lot of people have this idea that the use of a non-aggression principle should not be deleterious to human life, in the sense that it shouldn't be used in a way that leads to harming people. And that's one interpretation of it. An example of this would be in the case of, let's say, somebody's on a multi-story building and falls off a balcony and hangs on to one below it that is somebody else's property. Under this view, it would be considered unreasonable to attempt to force the person to cease his trespassing because it would lead to the death of the trespasser,
Mm-hmm.
even though the trespasser hasn't done anything that could be seriously aggressive. And therefore, the trespass would be tolerated in order to prevent an unnecessary loss of life. And so people say that there's a reasonableness qualification that needs to be made to the non-aggression principle. Otherwise, you end up like the memes that you have on the internet, where somebody's it's the fall and somebody's leaf falls onto your lawn, so you launch a nuclear strike or something uh, in response. And therefore, there's a reasonableness that many people have in how they apply the non-aggression principle in uh, in trying to not cause unnecessary harm, and also in having a proportional response to um, force that might have been initiated to someone by someone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these uh, these qualifications that people place upon a non-aggression principle, of course, would have to be rooted in other principles.
Right.
One problem I see, however, is that most groups that hold to the non-aggression principle, that is what I would refer to as the formal non-aggression principle, uh, that is held by libertarians and others. I'm actually making a distinction between the non-aggression principle and the golden rule and other such things, because I do think that there is a significant formal distinction between these. Uh, Most people that hold to the formal non-aggression principle um, don't really have a situation wherein they might have a common reason with others who hold to that principle to value certain things. What I mean by that is, for example, people that join the Libertarian Party have different backgrounds in religion, philosophy, and politics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these different backgrounds are going to influence what their values are. And though they may agree on the idea of a non aggression principle, exactly how it works out is going to be different based on what their other values are.
Right. And you see this often because I'm in libertarian Discord servers and have some libertarian friends and whatnot, and you see this very often. But bringing up an example that just recently happened in the Massachusetts party for the Libertarian Party of Massachusetts, the main state party, they just recently are trying to change their requirements, I guess you could call it, because they believe that potentially words could violate the NAP. So some people are debating the concept of if words can violate the non-aggression principle. And Massachusetts, with one of their members there, was doing some weird things, and they ended up kicking that member out, saying that he violated the NAP with his words and some actions. And some people were upset about that because their interpretation of the NAP, the non-aggression principle, was that words can't violate the NAP because free speech or whatever argument they would say. So even within libertarian circles, like you were just saying, there's great debate over the interpretation of this principle.
Yeah, because of course there's different ways to view what force is. Some people consider verbal abuse, for example, in a setting of domestic violence, there could be verbal abuse. Some people consider that to be a force uh, of sorts because it can be harmful to people, whereas others think that it would be excessive and perhaps a slippery slope to include such examples under a definition of force because it could potentially lead uh, to force being expanded to include things, including unintentional situations where somebody may have caused psychological harm um, through words in a way that could not have been predicted. So,
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, I I understand that there is a disagreement of opinion between different groups as to what exactly constitutes harm and force.
Right, for sure. And once again, I've said this multiple times already, but ultimately, I think the simplistic nature of it. Okay, I'll give you my interpretation of it first, I guess. So I've given you the definition that I take from it, but ultimately, I think that this principle is simple to get people to say like, yeah, I already believe that, yeah, or like, yeah, I mean, this makes sense. Kind of like the golden rule concept. Like everybody pretty much agrees with it. So they're like, okay, that's good. So then you can start to learn more about, the philosophy behind the non-aggression principle, the reasons why it makes sense, in other words. So I almost see the non-aggression principle as a building block and not like a full-on philosophical or full-on political theory almost. And maybe I'm interpreting it wrong, but that's almost kind of the way I see it. I don't see it as a yeah, I don't see it as a full theory in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Since you brought up the golden rule, I'd like to express why I think that there is a formal difference between the non-aggression principle and the golden rule. And of course, there are many different things that are called the golden rule, coming from different religious and philosophical traditions. The first one of these that was referred to as a golden rule is, of course, the Christian statement, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is also similar to the statement, love your neighbor as yourself.
Hmm.
And I would say that the reason why there's a formal distinction between this and the non aggression principle is not only because of its particular religious root, but also because of the dynamics of it, because it is essentially expressed as a restatement of a law, and therefore it is an imperative, a command, uh, which has a threat of force immediately placed upon disobedience to it, and which is enforced through a demand of obedience by a deity. So, in essence, there is a coercive element rooted behind this idea, uh, in the sense that this is a command from God, and if you disobey, it is a sin, and the wages of sin uh, is death, and therefore it is a powerful individual expressing his coercion upon humanity. And while I, as a Christian, don't have a problem with that, it, I would say, is different from a non aggression principle, which is you could say, a more agnostic position in that it doesn't have this idea of a metaphysical guidance built into it, and is frequently used to deny the exact type of coercion which is behind the idea of the golden rule, at least in the Christian concept.
Right. That's an interesting thought. I think not Roy. I just lost that out of my head. But the guy who came up with the concept of the non-aggression principle wrote it down. I know his name starts with the R, but I can't think of it right now. Anyway, there was a person behind the definition, but ultimately, if I understand what you're saying, ultimately he's writing it more of a he's writing it in a perspective of today's terms, or yeah, he's writing in the perspective of today's terms, catching people in that way, while the golden rule was from a deity, so to speak, from a higher power, from a Christian perspective, right? So
Yeah.
I think I understand what you mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying is that the Christian golden rule is not only incompatible with the non aggression principle in its metaphysical claims, but is, which the non aggression principle does not make, but also in its formula, which relies on an underlying coercive force, which the non aggression principle does not, at least in most views of libertarian philosophy, that is.
Right. Because there's even debate within that sphere of what the non-aggression principle means, from a pure definition sake, not just an interpretation sake, which is a little bit different in that way. Um, Trying to think of the best way to word this next question. I guess we'll put it this way. So, do you agree that it is simplistic, or maybe too simple, or do you think that that's just an excuse or something?
I think that it requires further elaboration. Now, this further elaboration could be done by expanding the non aggression principle or by postulating additional principles, as many do. And I would say that this elaboration is not something that I don't think is happening, because I do think it is happening. I think it happens every day when somebody looks at the non aggression principle and looks at his own actions and tries to justify his actions with the non aggression principle, and perhaps looks at arguments concerning the various forms of implementation of the non aggression principle. These different arguments necessarily, in order to be resolved, require someone to either expand the definition of a non aggression principle or postulate additional principles in order to have a consistent way to approach these ethical questions.
Right. Because it got me thinking a couple weeks ago, and this is what initially made me want to do this episode. Originally, we were going to have a guest, but we had to cancel it. And I tried to get another one, but it didn't work out because I was thinking of somebody that's been involved in the Libertarian Party for a long time and get his ideas of what he thinks of the non-aggression principle from somebody that, has been here a long time and ultimately has had to talk about it to new members and blah, 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 blah. So getting that perspective of it. But anyway, long story short, what originally made me think about doing this was thinking about philosophy in general, really. Not that the non-aggression principle has a little bit of philosophy in it, I would say, but a lot of like philosophy we read is, okay, I'll put it this way. Some philosophy we read is super structured and super, their theories or their ideas are detailed, and we know exactly what they thought of whatever this concept is. It's super set in stone almost. And then a lot
Yeah,
of
like reading Thomas Aquinas, for
right,
example.
right. And then you have a lot of philosophy that doesn't do that. And they bring up ideas and basically you have to interpret them yourself. So even from that standpoint, there's a lot of philosophy that simply you have to do a lot of extra work to interpret, and you have to do a lot of extra work to interpret. And I kind of saw the non-aggression principle a little bit like that. So that's what made me kind of want to do this episode, talking about it.
Yeah. So here I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And this is a philosophical question, and a question that I think anybody that is seriously considering the non aggression principle needs to have a serious thought about, and be able to make a serious answer. And that is the non aggression principle true? And when I say that, I mean, is it a recommendation that this is something that we have agreed should be done? Or is it a description of a moral fact that it is wrong to initiate force? So is the non aggression principle true?
I would say that the non-aggression principle is true. And when you say that, I've actually watched this podcast episode where they were discussing the non-aggression principle, and they kind of brought up a similar question. But the host asked him a similar question like you just asked me. He said, yes, I believe it, it to be true. And the host said, well, wouldn't that be, anarchy at that point? Having, no government to enact this. Because if you take the non-aggression principle and put it into political terms, the people that ultimately forced you to do things are the government, are from politics as a whole to local governments, So anyway, he was saying, well, wouldn't that ultimately be an anarchist society? Because you wouldn't have government to enact that force. And I think in a way that might, if you take it strictly as truth and branch off it and have a utopia society in a way, that could be the ultimate outcome of the non-aggression principle. Now, that being said, people are people, so I think even in an anarchist structure, there's going to be people that are going to uh, be the government, so to speak, enact that force. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is I think that the non-aggression principle is true, and I believe that and I believe that to be so. But I don't necessarily know if the non-aggression principle could ever be implemented as a entire uh, as an entire concept across the United States.
Yeah. So if you say that the non-aggression principle is true, what about it exactly makes it true?
What about it makes it true? Okay, so I would say the part that to me makes it the most true is it's a interesting question because I want to say that the part that makes it true to me, or at least what I believe the most about it, is saying that is with the military drafts and taxation and those parts, the parts that branch off it, I do think are something that is a use of force, right? So I'm like, I don't necessarily think we need to have military drafts because I think there will probably be enough people if a war were to come that would voluntarily do it. Now, is that the case? Don't know necessarily. Haven't been in war, and neither do I really want to be. But yeah, and also, I take a lot of what the non aggression principle says and think of it in terms of intervention in countries. So I think that our intervention into other countries is a violation of the non aggression principle. So I think that also that's an example that I like to use when talking about the non-aggression principle because it never really works out to try to be big brother to other countries as we recently discussed with Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, in the way that you describe that the non-aggression principle is true, what you've given me is examples of how people may be violating the non-aggression principle, but that doesn't actually tell me that it is something that is true. I perhaps a better question to answer would be, why is the initiation of force wrong?
Why is the initiation of force wrong? Okay. So I don't think that you should be okay. So this ultimately, I like to use examples, right, for answering questions. Uh, but I guess let's put it this way: any force ultimately, I don't think leads to a good outcome. Now, you could say that some force may be justified, and I think of saying such as like parents or something, right? Where you're in the grocery store and they're like, Johnny, stop playing with this toy, and he keeps playing with it, and knocking things over or whatever it may be, and the parent uses force, taking the toy away, and making punishing the kid in that way, right? He through the act of you could say is the act of force. But in those type of examples, I think that it could necessarily be justified. But I think when you talk about any force that's from a bad intention, and like the examples I used before, I think those are done with a bad intention in mind. And I would say that those actions of force don't lead to good outcomes.
Yeah. So your argument as to why the initiation of force is wrong is essentially a consequentialist argument that you are looking for good outcomes, and the initiation of force leads to bad outcomes, and therefore that initiation of force should be avoided.
Ultimately, I would say that
It,
that's a good way of putting my argument. Yeah.
okay. Now, if hypothetically speaking, the initiation of force led to improved outcomes, would that change your position on that?
I would have a hard time saying that that would lead to a good outcome, because I don't think any initiation of force does lead ultimately to a good outcome unless you're talking about really small examples of it, such as like I mentioned with parents. But hypothetically, let's say something like that were to happen. Ultimately, I think that everyone's outcome in this world should be to have a better planet, should be to, not so much from an environmental standpoint, although that's good too, but also from like a family structure, friend structure, word structure, person to person. You get what I'm saying. So ultimately, I think that we should be seeking for a better outcome. So if it were to get a better outcome, then I guess I would say that I'm for it. I just have an extremely hard time believing that that would ever happen.
Yeah. But this is exactly the mindset of revolutionary socialists. It, because they are the ones that believe that it would lead to a better outcome, and that is why they engage in revolution, uh, and initiate force against, for example, Marxists initiate force against the bourgeoisie. So, in that sense, I'm trying to explain that this argument is used by other groups, and because they come to a different conclusion on which leads to the better outcomes, they necessarily end up taking a different path in their perspective on the initiation of force. But of course, one of the interesting things about the non-aggression principle is that when you dig down to what is the underlying idea behind the non-aggression principle, you end up getting very many different answers. And this is, of course, because very many different groups have coalesced to agree on this idea, and therefore they all have different points of origin which they use to get to this idea. Now, some of them may have reached this conclusion uh, through a logical outworking of their values, whereas others might have this as a post hoc rationalization, um, where they hold the non aggression principle and then plug in their worldview to it in some way. And I think it's always important to, if you have foundational principles, to be able to justify the things that you end up with in your views based on those foundational principles, rather than going the other way around, which I think would be a dishonest way of moving. And that's why I strongly encourage anybody that holds to the non aggression principle to really examine why it is precisely that they hold to this.
Right. And ultimately, we've mentioned this before, but ultimately, it's it's such a bare bones concept almost that you almost have to have a full on philosophy behind this principle, and and then you can start to learn, you know, why in your examples it makes sense. It's not, yeah, right. So ultimately, I think of this as the person I believe who made this. I don't think was associated with Mises, uh, but Mises ended up writing a whole bunch about the NAP from a economic standpoint and a little bit from a social standpoint about, like the Federal Reserve was a common example he used, and that it was something that violated the American people because of reasons A, B, C, and D. So he wrote a whole uh, political theory, political philosophy, about the non-aggression principle from a economic perspective, and that was what he did. So it's an interesting thing in that it's almost so loose it can be interpreted to kind of wherever you want to put it in your definition. Because I was talking with a friend about the non-aggression principle, and he was kind of being funny, but he brought up like what would prevent a communist or a Marxist or whatever you want to call it from looking at the non-aggression principle and interpreting it in his way, and coming up with his interpretation of it. And ultimately, I don't think anything would prevent a communist from coming up with their definition of the non aggression principle. Yet, most of what these communists want to do, Marxists want to do, is the exact opposite of what somebody like Mises wrote about the non aggression principle. So it's a very interesting concept that you can get somebody on completely different aisles and be able to come up with their definitions or their points of what the non-aggression principle would look like.
Yeah. I think one of the main roots of the non-aggression principle, at least that is used philosophically, is property theory. And, and when I say property theory, I don't just mean how people own property in general, but specific statements on property ownership. For example, the idea of self ownership. And therefore, if self ownership is justified, then the violation of self ownership is not justified. And I think that that would be one of the ways in which self ownership would be linked to the non aggression principle. And also, as someone owning himself, also owns other things and has other property.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the problems that I see is that obviously the question of self ownership can be looked at in a number of different ways. And I'm sure that there's a lot of, for example, there's a lot of left leaning people that deny that a person can own himself in at least in a way that is comparable to the ownership of other property, and that they therefore consider it to be an illogical premise. But I would say that, for example, from the perspective of Abrahamic religions, uh, the sovereign or absolute, or you could say the exclusive self ownership principle is actually denied by these religions through the right of a higher power to exercise its own domain over lesser powers, in the sense that while a person may own himself to an extent, his ownership is subsidiary to that of a higher power because his rights linked to ownership can be countermanded by that higher power under these religious systems. And therefore, the idea of exclusive self ownership is denied, or at least the idea of exclusive self jurisdiction, you could say, is denied in favor of an idea of subsidiary ownership. Although it usually isn't described in this way, it's described in terms of authority and sovereignty and such things. But if we're talking property theory, I think the usage of ownership uh, makes sense here. And so when you get arguments, for example, Hans Hermann's Hoppe, sorry, Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation theory uh, relating to self ownership, which is the idea that if two persons argue, there is necessarily an acknowledgement that these two persons have minds and the ability to argue with each other, and therefore that they are in control of their faculties, which therefore indirectly affirms some idea of self control and, by extension, self ownership. That this, of course, does not necessarily imply that ownership is necessarily fully exclusive, or that if it is exclusive, that it cannot be removed from an exclusive status. And so, for example, I would argue that slavery is real, in the sense that there are people that literally do own other people, not just in the past, but in the world that we live in today. And that this, of course, is counter to the idea that self ownership is necessarily fully exclusive. That is, that this idea of self ownership would be descriptive of reality rather than prescriptive concerning certain values. So, of course, the perspective on slavery among many libertarians is that slavery is something that should not be allowed. Whereas I'm sure that there's other people that have the perspective, uh, as many people did in the ancient world, that under harsh conditions it would be allowable for someone to voluntarily become a slave. So I'm sure there's different perspectives on this, but I just want to point out that on the underlying issue of self ownership, there are different perspectives, and that therefore these are alternatives perspectives that need to be addressed whenever a discussion of that comes up in trying to justify the non aggression principle.
I don't know if you remember the discussion slash movie you had us talk about the monopoly on violence. You had a discussion on your channel about it. This is probably a year ago by now. But anyway, one of the ideas that the documentary brought up was social contract or is it construct or contract? Contract, I think.
Contract.
Contract, yes.
Yeah.
And
Although a social contract is a social construct in some way as well.
right.
Uh,
So that's kind of what I was thinking about a little bit when you were talking about that, because the documentary was basically like, yo, hey, we don't sign this document saying that we agree to be a part of the Society of America, or whatever it is. We don't sign a document saying like, yes, we opt in to taxation, or we opt in to blah 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 blah. And then they're like, you know what, instead we should have this as an outcome. And then it was panarchy. It was the Anyway, that's the whole point of that documentary show. But they brought up this idea that essentially we don't sign in as part of being part of this United States empire, or United States of America, whatever you want to call it. And I don't necessarily know if they said it directly, because my memory's not that great from a year ago, if they said that it did violate the non-aggression principle, but ultimately I think they applied that it does. So yeah.
yeah. And I think that this idea of a social contract is interesting, as we see it developed in the 1500s and 1600s, in philosophically speaking. Now, obviously, such ideas existed long before that, but that's when the modern philosophy of it developed. So we see people like George Buchanan, who was the tutor of King James, who held this idea. And then King James himself ended up going against this idea and instead affirming that his rule was based on, and we saw this when we read The True Law of Free Monarchies. His view is that his ancestors had conquered the land, and he had then inherited it from his ancestors, and therefore everybody living on the land um, had a duty of obedience to him, not just from that historical argument, but also he gives a religious argument as well. And then there's some decades later, you have Thomas Hobbes, who agrees with the social contract idea, but holds it as something that is formational to a society rather than something that is based on a more long term voluntary system, which is what a lot of these anarchists would prefer. Uh, that in each generation, or perhaps more specifically for each person, it would have to be affirmed. And of course, that goes farther down depending on which particular philosophy people uphold. And you see people like John Locke holding to this. Thomas Jefferson uh, favored social contract theory. And of course, at the same time, there's religious people, for example, John Jewell, who were against these ideas. And I don't think that, and I've mentioned this before, I don't think that the social contracts are real in the same way that that functioning governing processes are real, and that therefore I don't see them as being something that is particularly valid. Now, from a religious perspective, I don't oppose the idea of being ruled by someone without consent, because in my view, it's the natural state essentially to be ruled by God without one's own consent. So, in that perspective, that's different. Now, I understand there's a lot of atheists who don't hold that perspective, and therefore they might hold additional objections to other governing authorities uh, lower down because they hold a different background. But I I don't think that social contracts have ever been really functioning intergenerationally, in the sense that I don't think that there's a legal method of a social contract that has functioned intergenerationally. I can see more short-term social contracts such as the Mayflower Compact. That's a famous one, where the Pilgrims got together and they made a social contract uh, on how they would govern themselves in the colony. But in the long term, this eventually developed into a more long term government that did not utilize uh, continuing consent, in at least not in the way that anarchists would describe it. Now, some people would consider participation in the government and society to be consent. I wouldn't agree that this is right, but I also don't agree that it is necessary. So,
Mhm.
in that the consent is necessary in that case. And of course, that's a big difference between me and anarchists. But essentially, what I'm saying is that social contracts don't exist as much as people want them to exist. So I would say that rather than being something that's descriptive of a society, I would say it's a prescriptive thing that is desired by such individuals for a society to have.
Right. It would be a interesting concept about if you were just randomly to say, like, you send out a form or a link to a website now, because everything's tech. But anyway, you send out something to people and they're like, do you want to be a part of the United States, yes or no? It would be interesting to see what percentage would come back from people. I have a high feeling that it's going to be a very high percentage of people that would say that they want to be a part of the United States, despite the way politics is to the end today. But it would be interesting to kind of to see those numbers. Now, that's never going to happen, really, but yeah, just an idea.
Yeah. Now, of course, I think that there are people that already behave as if this were true, as we see among some sovereign citizens, for example.
Yeah, yeah, sovereign citizen. Oh man, I watched one of those videos recently. Yeah, so we could probably spend an episode on that topic again, but I was having an idea. And we can go over this quick, but I was having the idea like I wonder what a libertarian or an anarchist would think of a sovereign citizen, because in general a sovereign citizen is against the government, right? But at the same time they do it in such a weird way because they end up making their own laws to try to go against it, their own statutes or whatever you want to call it, to go against it. So at the same time, they're not exactly going about it the right way, but they're still going against the government. So, yeah.
Yeah. For example, they form what they call common law grand juries and such things, and they have their own documents, and then they uh, put liens on people and such things.
Hmm.
So, in a sense, I wouldn't say that sovereign citizens are anarchists in the sense that most anarchists are, because sovereign citizens acknowledge the existence of a government and they're not actively attempting to destroy the government. They're simply attempting to not participate in its ordinary functions.
Right. That's why it's kind of a hybrid type of thing. They go about it in a unique way, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say that there is a difference. Now, that being said, I'm sure that there probably is some overlap. I'm sure that there's some sovereign citizens who might be ANCAPs or who might be some flavor of libertarian, because there is an overlap in ideas somewhat. And I'm not saying that all libertarians are sovereign citizens. I think that
No.
would be an absurd statement to make. I'm What I am saying, however, is that I can see a common sentiment, in a sense, there
Right.
in some areas.
Yeah, only the crazy ones become the sovereign citizens. No. I guess. mm, I guess I can ask this question, but this sounds like such a weird question to ask. But do you think that the sovereign citizens violate the non-aggression principle?
Well, they are usually responding to the government. Now, that doesn't always happen, but they're usually responding to the government. Now, if you take the stance that government actions, that the actions of a government that you have not consented to are unjustifiable uses of force, regardless of what you think is the proper response to that. If you take that particular perspective, then I don't think that they would be considered to be violating the non aggression principle per se, because they are simply responding to a government uh, which they consider unjustified in that way.
Right, because it is interesting. You have, from our discussion of the sovereign citizens, you have some sovereign citizens that generally do it right. They have good intentions. Well, that's more First Amendment auditors, but anyway, that have good intentions. I struggle to find any sovereign citizens that do, but anyway. So
Yeah.
there's,
Well,
yeah,
now, of course, when it descends into making false liens
yeah,
on people's homes and filing false documents in courts and making legally unsound arguments, I don't think that that falls under a response, an appropriate response to force. So, in that sense, I would not consider that to be activity that is justified under the non aggression principle.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're simply objecting to the government, making false forms and attempting to say that you are in compliance with the government while making false and illegal forms is in many ways, I wouldn't say it's a step beyond, because it's not really like they're escalating beyond something. They are responding to what they perceive to be a wrong by committing a different wrong uh, that is not actually directly responding to the wrong which they have perceived done against themselves.
Right. And you also have examples of this is more with First Amendment auditors, but they go into, say, the post office or whatever place, and they try to ultimately cause a disturbance or cause something to happen. Not necessarily a fist fight or anything like that, but they're ultimately there with intentions to start something and get the police involved. Some of them, not all, but some. And ultimately, you could argue that that is a violation of the non-aggression principle because you could be violating the terms of the people who are in the post office, and let alone necessarily. But yeah, right.
Well, the USPS is a corporation.
Yes.
So, although it is government, it is also a corporation. Um, so, in that sense, exactly how you behave while in a USPS area, it can be regulated by the USPS, and therefore doing anything you want in a post office is actually not something that is allowable.
Right.
And of course, there's different arguments that they make because, of course, certain areas you are allowed to do a wide range of things in a post office. But in some areas, for various reasons, they may decide that they don't want to have people doing weird things in the post office. And because it is a corporation, they have some ability to regulate the behavior of people when they are interacting with that corporation, and therefore when they are on the property of that corporation.
Right. Because
Of course, the U.S. government, though sovereign citizens may object to this, the U.S. government is a corporation as well. However, by its nature, as being a government, it is different in the way that it behaves from uh, private corporations.
right. It's a First Amendment auditors and sovereign citizens are still something that kind of amazes me in a lot of ways about their philosophies and theories, and they're a wide spectrum of what they're trying to do. Some with good intentions, some not so much. But the whole idea itself, like you mentioned already, I don't necessarily think violates the non aggression principle, but some actions they do, you could argue, does. When, even though they're not necessarily the government themselves. Because I think the non aggression principle doesn't always have to imply with the government. It's just when you talk about politics and the Libertarian Party and most people that have adopted the non aggression principle is to do with politics, so then you go to government. I haven't really seen too many people adopt the non aggression principle outside of politics. Maybe I haven't seen it yet. There may be something there, but not that I've seen.
Yeah. So anyway, I would say that I think we can wrap up here. I would say my final comments are that full disclosure, I personally don't adhere to the non-aggression principle, not in the sense that I go around and attack people. I also don't think that's justified. I just don't agree with the formal formulation of the non-aggression principle due to my own religious reasons. I follow different principles that have certain religious and philosophical underpinnings that disagree with the non-aggression principle in certain points. Although I will say that it is a positive thing to not needlessly engage in force.
Yes, and to conclude for myself, I would say that I kind of view the non aggression principle. It is something I generally believe, but I ultimately think it's more of a building block than a 100% solid philosophy or something like that. You have to look into a lot more things, a lot more readings, a lot more philosophy to understand how to implement it in your life necessarily. So, although it's simple, it takes a lot more work than it ultimately would appear to do so. But I still think it is useful more than not useful. And on that note, next week's Getting the Answers will be on Anna Volta's channel. So go make sure to check out his channel on YouTube, and we will be there next Wednesday. Uh,
Yes,
yeah.
and remember to like and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more content, and leave a comment if you perhaps disagree with what we said, or perhaps you may want to suggest something for the future.
Yes, we do read all the comments. Alrighty, thank you everybody, and we'll catch you on the next one.